Hi everyone, it's Talia from Zart Art, and today we're going to be creating a Jocelyn Proust inspired textiles piece. So Proust is an Australian contemporary artist who creates many works inspired by the natural flora and fauna of Australia. She has a very graphic design to her work as well. So here is a little example of what we'll be making. So I've pre-cut some pieces for our work out of iron-on transfer sheets. So these are the sheets that we'll be working with today, and they can be transferred onto a variety of different materials. So here I've got some matte coloured iron-on sheets, and here I've got some glitter iron-on sheets. So we'll be using a combination of the two, but you can buy an assortment of colours in either the plain or the glitter. And I've also created this little example of our iron-on sheets ironed onto a piece of vinyl. So you can work on calico, cotton, vinyl. You can work on a variety of different things as well. So we'll be using a calico bag, but you could create designs for shoes, hats, t-shirts. So there's lots of variety in what you can create. So this is what we'll be creating. I've drawn out the design for my work to begin with. So I've drawn my flower shapes and then cut them out from the iron-on sheets. So I'm going to show you the process in how I did this using this flower design. So we'll move our bag and our cutout pieces to the side. So using our flower, I'm going to show you how you can create your own design onto the iron-on sheets. So I used a combination of freehand and trace drawings for this. So if we have a look at the calico bag, I've traced out my design for my bird, so that's why it has been flipped, because I've drawn it on the reverse of my iron-on sheet and then flipped it around, so that's the reverse of my tracing. And this little flower I've done freehand, so I'm going to do a combination of tracing and freehand for my next flower. So what I'm going to do is trace the stem, and when I'm using my iron-on sheets, I prefer to draw on the matte side than the shiny side, and that's because sometimes when you are drawing with something like a permanent marker on this shiny side, and you iron over it, it can have a tendency to smudge your marker. So if you are working on the matte side, which will be the side facing down onto the bag, that's not going to smudge with your iron. So that's why I prefer to use this side, but you can draw over the shiny side as well. So just using my marker, I'm going to trace around my cutout, and then I'll cut that out of the iron-on sheet. And because it will be a little bit bigger, because I've traced it with a broad black marker, I'm just going to cut it down on the inside of the line. Okay, so now for the rest of my flower, I'm going to freehand draw it instead of tracing it. Because I've drawn layers inside of layers, it's going to be hard to trace that out unless you cut down all the pieces. So what I'm going to do is have my cutout next to me, and then I get a bit of a gauge of the size. And what I tend to do is draw things a little bit bigger than what you anticipate you'll need. And that's because it's much easier to cut down your shape into something smaller than having to redraw it and then recut it if you want it to be a bit bigger. So always draw a little bit bigger and then cut it down, and then you'll find that much easier to work with than drawing things too small. Okay, so now for my next pieces, again, I'm going to have my already cut out piece next to me, just so I can gauge that size, draw a little bit bigger, and I'll continue this for the next layer and cut it out and see how they all look stacked on top of each other to create those layers. Okay, so we've got our flower design cut out, combination of tracing or freehand. You can use a combination of both or do either or depending on what level the students are at and what they feel comfortable with. So that's our Jocelyn Proust inspired flower. When you are creating your designs, you do want to make sure that you stick to simple shapes that are easy to cut out with scissors. Smaller shapes can be a bit difficult to work with, but if you are working with higher level students, then you can challenge them to try and use some of those smaller shapes. But if you're working with lower level students, then you might want to reduce the amount of layers that they're working in, as well as using those more large shapes instead of ones that are too small and fiddly to handle. So now we'll bring back our bag and I'll just place my design onto the bag. So if you're working on a surface that has an odd shape and you're really taking into account the composition, then you probably want to lay down where your work is going to be ironed on, because once you've ironed it on, you can't take it back off very easily. So I think this will be my placement, and the fun part about using the iron-on sheets and working in so many layers is that you have to stick the layer by layer on with your iron. So to do that, I'm going to begin with this flower design, and what I'm going to do is take all of my pieces off until we have our first layer. Now remember, with your iron-on sheets, you want the matte side to be facing down onto the surface that you're ironing onto, and that shiny plastic side will sit on top. So there is a plastic layer in between which you can iron onto, so you don't want to peel that plastic layer off yet, because if you do, then the iron-on sheet is very flexible and can be hard to maneuver onto your surface. So moving some of our things out of the way, we have an ironing board, which I will carefully pull down. Okay, so we've got our work on our ironing board. You will also need baking paper. This is just to protect your iron and the sheet. Cut that. So just a small piece of your baking paper. So your first layer, arrange it exactly how you want it placed. Tracing paper or baking paper over the top. Now with your iron, depending on what kind of iron you have, you want it on the dry setting and the cotton setting. And you do want to make sure that it is nice and heated up. Don't touch the iron to make sure it is hot. So just let it heat up for a little bit, and I think that should be good to go. So as you're ironing, you want to go up and down, side to side, to make sure that you are ironing over that whole area. And we want to iron it for about 30 seconds to a minute. And that will make sure that it is nice and adhered to the calico. Okay, so that should be stuck down, and that will still be hot. So I'm not going to touch that or peel the plastic off yet, because you do want to make sure that that's completely cooled down before you peel your plastic off. If you try to do it while it's hot, you might damage the iron-on sheet underneath and it will become wrinkled. So I'm not going to touch it. Instead, I'm going to move on to my next flower and arrange that bottom layer. So we want it slightly overlapping, which means I will start with my stem first and then do those coloured flower areas after that. So you do have to work piece by piece if you are doing something with quite a few layers. Making sure that my first iron-on piece is cooled down and it feels like it's okay. So if you've got nails, this will be a lot easier, and all art teachers should have nails, because how do you open anything? So just gently peeling off that plastic film, and that leaves your coloured iron-on sheet. So like I said before, just make sure you don't do it while it's hot because it does have a tendency to pull off the iron-on sheet if it is still warm. But you can just remove those pieces of plastic. Make sure that you are being quite gentle. So if there's an area that's not giving much give, just try a different area and pull that off. And last one. Now the next step in this process is to do the next layer. So we've got our little veins of the leaf. Make sure that you are putting it the right way. So just have a feel of where that plastic is. Sometimes the glitter one's a little bit more difficult to find which side is which, especially if you're working with very small pieces, but you should be able to see the shine of the plastic. Make sure it's configured in the right way. So if you are doing this with kids and you're placing everything down before you complete your work, you might want to take a picture so the kids can see where each piece sits. Otherwise they might get confused when they're putting it back together later on of what goes where. Now that one, I'm just going to make sure that I am putting it in the right position, and to do that you want to make sure everything will be sitting in the right spot. So that's my second layer. Place my tracing paper over the top and then we iron again. So now we can peel off the plastic from our next layer. Just be gentle with that as you're pulling it off and make sure it cools down in between. Make sure you do remove all the plastic, and then I'll move on to my next flower, peeling off that first layer, and then we'll iron on our second layer, and then we'll keep repeating until all of our layers are attached. So we are peeling off the plastic in between each layer, because if you iron on one layer on top of another layer that has the plastic still attached, you can't peel off that plastic anymore. So do make sure that every layer that you're working on, that you are peeling off that plastic, because once you've ironed on over the top of that, there's no removing it. So I've made sure that layer of plastic is removed, and we can also do this section of our flower as well, making sure our matte side is face down. Now I can iron that, and then I'll move on to the third and the fourth layer of our flowers. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to my bird design at the top. So I've got my reference image here so I can remember where everything is going to be placed. Now this one is going to be much more complicated than the flowers, because we've got some fanning out feathers, which are actually the backdrop to our body of the bird. So you can see the overlap here. So this one's right in the back, this one's overlapping over the top, then this one, but then this bird's little booty is going over the top of that. So to complete this iron on, we are going to start with the top feather, and then move to the next feathers and then the body over the top. So again, you just need to make sure that you know where your layers are sitting, what's one over the top of the other, and making sure you're removing that plastic in between each one, and letting it cool down in between as well is very important. If you're putting a hot piece of iron-on onto another hot piece of iron-on, and then you put more ironing on top of that, then some of the areas of your sheets could start to wrinkle or even melt a little bit. So as you're ironing, you do want to make sure that you're checking every few seconds or so to make sure that it is attached, and to make sure you haven't overdone the heat as well. Because we are working in so many layers, there is a tendency to go a little bit too hot because we're not waiting for those layers to cool down in between enough. So just make sure that as you're ironing, you're checking every few seconds to make sure you aren't overheating. Okay, so here we have our finished piece. So you can see the bird has been ironed on in all of its layers. So it is quite a bit of planning to figure out which layer goes when and when to iron it and peel off the plastic. But it's quite a fun process and great for teaching skills in layering, composition, and it's a really fun textiles piece that you can experiment a lot with. You can try different kinds of textiles pieces, like I mentioned before, t-shirts, hats, shoes, anything that's cotton, calico, or even a vinyl base can be used with these iron-on sheets. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.